Does your art style suck? Are you tired of looking for ways to improve it? You saw the title, you know what you gotta do. Today we're going to figure out why you should even draw in another style, and then we'll go into how to actually dissect an art style and what to look for when you're trying to replicate that style. And we'll wrap things up with ways to incorporate another style into your own and a bit of homework. So to start, why even bother drawing in another style? And the answer is pretty straightforward. Trying to build a style without understanding how other artists have constructed theirs is really like just reinventing the wheel. And if you clicked on this video, you know firsthand that it can be like hitting your head against a brick wall. So instead of that hot mess, we're just gonna study. And the best thing about this is studying means making fan art, basically. We're gonna look at artists that we admire and aspire to, and really dive deep into their world and try to understand why they do the things they do and how those things make their work so damn good. And while it is possible to just look at another artist's work and try to pull bits and pieces into your own style, it'll be way easier to analyze their work once you've experienced it firsthand. And with that experience and understanding, you'll naturally know what you want to actually bring into your style because it'll be things that were more intuitive to you and parts of the process that you enjoyed. With that out of the way, let's get into the skills that you're going to need to deconstruct another artist's style so that you know which artistic muscles to flex when you're trying to replicate it. The piece that I'm working on today is in the style of Legend of Korra, and I'm drawing myself as a waterbender. And this will be a perfect example because until making this piece, I have never explored this style at all. In fact, I've never really done cartoony work at all. If you check my Insta or whatever, you'll see I basically just do sketches and then pretty realistic digital paintings. And some vector art mixed in there. My art style's a mess, okay? I'm in the same boat as you guys. So I really had to approach this in a way that wouldn't completely overwhelm me. So the way that I broke down this art style was by breaking it into two main categories: structure and rendering. In the structural phase, you focus on the proportions, perspective, and shape design of the piece. And then when you get into rendering, we start talking about color palettes, the use of value, how they render textures, light and shadow. Is it a flat graphic style or is it more painterly? You know, all that jazz that you're probably more interested in. But before we get to flashy rendering, you really got to start with a good, solid structure. So we'll start with perspective because this will probably be the most obvious one when you're looking at a piece. And the scale here ranges from perfectly flat 2D, Paper Mario style, all the way up to reality, right? Now you would think this only really comes into play when you're dealing with compositions and backgrounds, but Legend of Korra is a really dynamic show with lots of flowy, graceful animation, and they actually use perspective a ton while elements are flying through the air and everyone's doing crazy kung fu fighting. And because of that, it was important to me to really capture that feeling in my character. Otherwise, you know, you just draw someone standing there and it's like, sure, they're dressed like a waterbender, but like, what are they actually doing? Like, are they in the universe really? So really pay attention to the use of perspective in the character as well as the environments of the pieces that you're studying. Now, if you're studying a piece with like crazy perspective that you don't have the skills yet to achieve, create a composition that's just in 1-point perspective. At least put in the effort to show, yes, there's perspective in my piece. No, it's not as crazy as this other artist is capable of, but you know, I tried, I did my best to adapt their style. And if you're not comfortable with dynamic characters like this one, it's perfectly okay to create a character like in a more side profile or from a view that you're more comfortable with. You don't have to deal with foreshortening, but really pay attention to the action of the pose and do your best to eliminate any stiffness in the pose. Once you've taken some notes on what you're going to do with perspective, you're going to move on to proportions. And proportions along with shape design make up a lot more of a person's art style than you might think that they do. But what do we mean when we say proportions? Proportions are really just how big or small a thing is compared to the other aspects of the image. And an example that I like to look at is the buildings in a more fantasy kind of world. Oftentimes you'll see that the rooftops of those buildings are exaggerated a ton. Like you've got way more roof overhang than you probably normally would. Everything's just kind of bigger than you would see in reality. And as far as I can tell, that's done to really help the silhouettes stand out when towns or cities or castles are viewed from a distance. And it stays aesthetically pleasing when you're up close too, so win-win. The tricky thing about proportions is that they apply to everything in the scene. So you're not just looking at the buildings and how their proportions are skewed, you actually have to look at the building itself and how its proportions relate to other buildings or trees or characters. And I'm not gonna lie, this is difficult to kind of manage and just kind of observe if your observational skills are a bit more lacking, but that doesn't mean that you can't try. Do your best to analyze the scene and really just stay cognizant of what everything is doing and how everything is shaped and sized. I lucked out with Legend of Korra because they actually have very realistic proportions for basically everything. The only real exception is characters' eyes as far as I could tell. And since I'm right at home with realism, this was an easy win for me. And as far as structure goes, the final piece of the puzzle is shape design. This is a particularly expressive component in an artist's work, and unique shape design can really change the way an image is perceived. For example, does your artist use more angular lines, or is everything a little smoother and rounder? Do they use more traditional geometry, or are all of their shapes more organic? Small changes like this add up, and they can quickly change an art style, even if the two styles share perspective and proportional identities. In this example, we've got Doug Funny from Doug on the left, and Connie Maheshwaran from Steven Universe on the right. And you'll notice they've actually got very similar proportions, the biggest difference being the size of Doug's feet, though generally Doug's clothing is also oversized. However, even though both characters are roughly 4 heads tall, the shapes used to construct Connie are far more anatomically accurate, giving a sense of real-world muscles on the character. But beside her, Doug is just a little noodle boy. They've got arms around the same length and the same sized hands, but his arms and legs are basically uniform lines. Now, I know this is a more obvious example, but this kind of analysis can really go a long way, especially if you're looking at a piece of art and you're not even sure what makes it cool and what makes it appealing to you. Okay, and that's about it for structure. Just to recap, you're going to pay attention to the perspective, the proportions, and the shape design of the art style. And with those 3 things, you can get through the sketch portion of your image. And even if you do just want to learn rendering techniques from an artist that you're studying, you might surprise yourself with what you learn in this phase. Moving on to rendering, we're going to break it down the same way we did with structure. And here you want to worry about your edge design, the lighting, how you're rendering textures, and your color palettes. But let's start with edge design. Now, depending on the work that you're studying, you'll either be implementing this up front or as you paint your image. And in the case of Legend of Korra, there's definite line art that defines each piece. So I'm going to start with my edges and to knock out that line art. If you're studying a style that uses line art, you're really just paying attention to how thick or thin the lines are and trying to replicate that. I actually kind of failed in that regard, and in this piece, looking at actual work from Legend of Korra, you'll see that they've got very thin, uniform lines throughout the piece. There's no expression within the lines. They're simply there to contain their shapes. And in fact, there isn't even any real line work within the shapes. You'll see in some art styles that lines around the edges can creep into the image to add some definition. But there isn't really a ton of that in Legend of Korra, and for some reason I couldn't wrap my head around that, and I kept trying to cut lines in. But you'll see later on in the process, I completely just give up on this and go back to what the style is actually like. However, my line thickness was still off, and to be honest, I didn't really want to redo it, and it looked okay to me, so, you live and you learn. Line art makes edge design really simple and straightforward, but what if there isn't line art in the piece that you're studying? What if it's just a crazy painting? In that case, we're really going to need to get into the concept of hard and soft edges. There's an artist on YouTube named Marco Bucci, and if you haven't heard of him, I highly suggest looking him up. He's got this 10 Minutes to Better Painting series, and he goes over in excellent detail the differences between different edges and how to achieve them. But I'll sum it up here real quick. The borders of your shapes can be anything from a crisp hard edge to a completely faded out gradient. And what you decide to use in a specific place will change the look and feel of your work. So the most obvious place to look for this is in the shading of the actual piece. You can see in Legend of Korra, everything has a defined hard edge, even the shading within the piece. But other styles obviously will blend out those forms and shapes and even add different tones within. And all of this can add complexity and form, but you can see in this case that's not at all what they want. They want a quick, easy read on the character as it's moving. A less obvious example of this is looking at lighting and seeing if the artist chose to merge their shadow shapes or their lightest shapes together to bring a sense of unity to common elements in the piece. And this is a bit of a mix between good shape design and good edge design. When a pro artist merges their shapes, they're doing it for a reason, and it's usually to convey more with less. So when you're looking at a piece, really try to isolate separate colors and try to recognize the difference between a gradient across a big span and a soft blended out edge. And of course, crisp hard edges always have their role to play. Otherwise, your image is just going to look faded and flat. And this is why it's very often recommended for beginners to stay away from the airbrush if they're into digital work. Because it's very tempting to just softly blend everything together, but you really lose a lot of character if everything in your image is just soft and blended out. You really need those hard defined edges to set boundaries and really break up an image for the viewer. And that'll lead us directly into light and shadow, or the use of value. If lighting throws you off, it might be a good idea to take your image and completely desaturate it, so that you can just focus on bright spots and dim spots without colors getting in the way and trying to confuse the image for you. It's also useful to take your image and zoom it down really small so that you're getting the most basic read of the forms as you can. And you'll see the importance of these fundamentals if you ever watch speed paints of like really good artists working. You might notice that they actually lock down the look and feel of their image really early in their process. And if you were to just look at a thumbnail version of their piece, you might even wonder why they continue to spend hours working on it. Now, obviously at full scale, they need to deal with all of the details and, rendering out textures and whatever. But a lot of the heavy lifting happens with your use of value and how light is expressed. Once you've got a sense for the shapes of light and shadow, it's time to look at the actual value range. Most artists don't actually use the entire range from brightest of whites to darkest of blacks. There's usually a smaller subsection that they're using to convey what they need. And the reason why their work is still so successful is because they know how to use contrast to their advantage. So if you do need a more stark difference in your lighting, you're going to use a harder edge, and B, you're going to use the extent of your value range. Whereas more subtle shading will be done with smaller increments in value and perhaps softer edges. So as you're analyzing the art style, just take a look and see how often is this artist actually using pure black or pure white. Do they tend to go to the darker side of the value range, or is everything they make a little more bright and bubbly? Or are they somewhere in the middle? You're really going to have to just check it out and see what you see. Moving right along, we'll go into colors next. And this one's pretty straightforward. You're just gonna try to mimic the colors that you see in the piece. So aside from the obvious main colors that you see, you're gonna wanna look into the shadows and the lights and see which other colors are subtly playing into the main base color of that area. An artist might incorporate a bunch of different hues into the same area to create a complex color conversation in the piece. And this can be really effective when it's done well. Have I ever done it well? No. But I'm definitely going to be studying artists and art styles that do incorporate this well, because color is something that I really personally need to work on, and I would love to learn from the masters when doing it. Now, in the case of this piece, I lucked out again because everything is flat and very graphic. It's very easy to pick colors and fill them in, so if you're not very confident with your color choices yet, maybe something with a simpler, more cartoony style is the way to go. But as you become more comfortable with color dynamics, then there's definitely things to be learned from more painterly artists. And a special note for anyone working digitally, I do recommend actually trying to pick colors yourself instead of using an eyedropper tool. I didn't eyedrop any of my colors. I tried to just match them as closely as I could. And now since the piece is done and I'm looking at it, I can see that I actually oversaturated a bunch of the colors on myself. And if I had just used an eyedropper tool, I wouldn't have actually been putting in the mental work to figure out which colors I should be using, what's working, what isn't. So you'll definitely get more out of the exercise if you actually put in the mental energy and pick colors yourself. And finally, with all of the fundamentals out of the way, we can talk about rendering textures. And I'm not going to go too far into detail here because this could be an entire video on its own. And if you'd like to see that, just drop a comment below. But this is really a culmination of everything else we talked about today, with a definite focus on shape design, edge design, color, and value. And my main takeaway from working on this piece was the water textures and feel. This was hands down the most difficult part for me. I had to go through a bunch of different water bending references to see exactly how they get water to look and feel the way that it does. And I never would have guessed that they just use like simple oval shapes in their darker sections of shading the water and adding that texture. And when I tried it, initially, it just wasn't working. And you can see in my process here, I actually try to do the water a bunch of different times. And every time I fail, I'll go and find another reference and see what exactly was working and what wasn't. And you know, this is kind of just where persistence comes into play. You just got to try and experiment and play. You definitely have a big advantage here if you're working digitally. But if you're painting, I mean, with acrylic paint, you can really just paint over your mistakes. Oil paint is very forgiving as well. If you're into watercolor, you might want to do smaller studies and a higher volume of studies because, I mean, you're bound to make some ugly work while you're in the process of learning, right? It's just how it goes. So don't be too hard on yourself if you have to like give it a couple of tries. I am so glad that I did take the time to really figure out how they did their texture because I honestly was going to give up a bunch of times and do something more in my own kind of way of shading. But when I finally nailed down the way that they were achieving their look with different colors and shapes, I was so happy with how the results turned out. And yeah, it's not perfect, but you know, I'm still learning. There's no way I'm going to be drawing like the masters after a single study, but I'll definitely be taking what I've learned here and applying it in the future. And I get the feeling that now that I know how to paint water like this, the next couple of pieces I make will probably have water in them just because I'll find it fun and satisfying to work on. And there we have it, one complete style study. So what I want you to do is pick an art style that you'd like to study from and have at it. If you're less comfortable creating your own compositions, then you can do a direct master study, which is when you try to just replicate the piece in front of you verbatim. But if you're really feeling your creative juices flowing, then create your own composition like I did. And then you're going to analyze the art style the way that we discussed and try to apply as much of that as you possibly can into your own piece. Once you're done, take some time to admire the piece and ask yourself what you enjoyed in the process. What worked and felt intuitive to you, and what was just frustrating and made you want to stop, basically. I think having fun with art is the most important thing, so personally I bring things into my own work that I enjoy instead of things that I find to be painful. Now I know studying the water was painful in and of itself, but now that I've done it, I understand that that's something that I'm going to enjoy adding to my process in the future. Whereas line art itself is something that I'm not a big fan of. I prefer more painterly styles, so this is something that I'm going to maybe leave on the table. But what you get out of the study is really going to be personal and depends on your own preferences. And that's the beauty of it. That's why everyone has their own art style and not everything looks generic and the same. So really embrace the things that you naturally embrace and discard anything that you don't think is important. And with that, you'll be well on your way to creating your own awesome art style. And with that, I think we're done. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribe if you're interested in more actionable art advice. So thanks so much for watching. I really hope you gained something from this experience. And comment below with your favorite artist/art style. I love discovering new artists and I'd love to broaden my horizons. All right, peace.